History remembers Hades as the god below, the shadowed ruler, the distant king, the name whispered when the story moves away from sunlight and into the unseen world. In modern imagination, Hades is often treated like a villain, a dark opposite to the gods above, a figure closer to punishment than balance, closer to fear than wisdom. But the older Greek story is more complicated. Hades was not the devil of Greek mythology. He was not simply the god of evil, and in many ancient traditions, he was not even the god who caused death. He was the one who ruled what came after. That difference changes everything, because perhaps Hades was feared not because he was cruel, but because he represented something the Greeks understood deeply. Every life, no matter how glorious, eventually crosses the same boundary. And the god waiting beyond that boundary was not chaotic. He was lawful, silent, unavoidable. So the real question is not only why Hades was feared. The real question is this: what if Hades was never the villain we imagined, but one of the most misunderstood gods in Greek mythology? And if that is true, what does his reputation reveal about the way cultures turn uncomfortable truths into dark figures? This question matters because Hades' story is not just about one god. It is about how memory works. It is about how later storytellers reshape older myths. And it is about why the god associated with endings was so easily transformed into a symbol of darkness. But to see that clearly, we have to begin with the version most people think they know. Most people know Hades as the ruler of the underworld. In paintings, games, films, and modern retellings, he often appears as cold, ambitious, bitter, or villainous. He is placed beneath the earth, far from Olympus, and that distance alone makes him feel suspicious. Zeus has the sky. Poseidon has the sea. Hades has the dead. So the modern mind often fills in the rest. If he rules below, he must be darker. If he rules the dead, he must enjoy death. If his kingdom is feared, he must be cruel. But ancient Greek mythology does not work that simply. The underworld was not identical to later religious ideas of hell. Hades was the king of the dead and the ruler of the underworld, but Greek myth also distinguishes him from Thanatos, the personification of death itself. That distinction is important. Hades did not roam the world creating endings. He did not tempt mortals into wrongdoing. He did not stand as the cosmic enemy of the gods. He had a domain, and within that domain he maintained order. This is where the familiar belief begins to crack. Because the more closely we look at Hades, the less he resembles a simple villain, and the more he resembles something much older, colder, and more difficult to categorize. A ruler of boundaries. Why does this matter? Because when a culture misunderstands a figure like Hades, it often reveals what that culture is afraid to face. Hades became associated with darkness because his realm was unseen. He became associated with fear because mortals feared the journey to his kingdom. He became associated with finality because no one entered his world unchanged. But fear does not automatically mean evil. In ancient Greek imagination, the underworld was part of the structure of existence. It was not a mistake in the cosmos. It was not outside divine order. It was one of the great divisions of reality. According to mythic tradition, after the defeat of the Titans, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades divided the cosmos. Zeus received the sky, Poseidon the sea, and Hades the realm below. This means Hades was not an exile in the simple sense. He was a sovereign. His kingdom was not glamorous. It did not shine like Olympus. It did not move like the sea, but it was necessary. And that is what makes his story so powerful. If Hades was only a villain, the story would be easy. But if he was a feared yet necessary ruler, then the story becomes a reflection of something deeper, the human tendency to confuse discomfort with wrongdoing. We often distrust what we do not want to face. And no Greek god embodied that more completely than Hades. The hidden perspective is this: Hades may have been feared less because of his personality and more because of his function. Ancient sources often present him as stern, distant, and difficult to soften. But they do not consistently present him as reckless or chaotic in the way many other gods can be. Zeus is powerful, but his myths are filled with impulsive desire, conflict, and disruption. Poseidon is majestic but also unpredictable, capable of anger and sudden force. Ares represents the disorder of battle. Dionysus brings ecstasy and destabilization. Hades, by contrast, rarely leaves his realm. His power is still. His authority is quiet. His presence is final. That stillness may be exactly why he feels so unsettling. He does not need to chase mortals. All mortals come to him eventually. This is not the behavior of a trickster or destroyer. It is the role of a keeper. Theoi's summary of Hades describes him not only as king of the underworld, but also as a god connected with funeral rites, the proper treatment of the dead, and the hidden wealth beneath the earth. That last detail is especially revealing. Hades was also known as Plauton, a name connected to wealth. The idea was not simply gold in a treasure room, but the riches hidden beneath the earth, metals, minerals, and the fertility that allows crops to grow. So the god beneath the earth was not only connected to endings, he was also connected to what the earth conceals: seeds, metals, buried wealth, the unseen processes that sustain life from below. This creates a powerful contradiction. The same ground that receives the dead also feeds the living. And Hades stands at that boundary. He's not warm, he's not comforting, but he's not meaningless darkness either. He is the god of what lies beneath the surface, physically, emotionally, and symbolically. That may be why his story endured, because every civilization has to ask what lies under its own certainty. And Hades was the answer the Greeks placed below. But Hades' reputation becomes more complicated when we compare sources and retellings. There is no single fixed version of Greek mythology. Stories changed across poets, regions, cult practices, artistic traditions, and later interpretations. The most famous story involving Hades is the myth of Persephone. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, Persephone is taken by Hades, but the hymn also states that Zeus had given her to him. Demeter, Persephone's mother, was not part of that decision, and her grief becomes central to the story. This is one of the most sensitive and complex myths in Greek tradition, and it must be handled carefully. In modern terms, the story raises difficult questions about power, consent, family authority, divine arrangement, and the emotional cost of decisions made by gods above the human world. But in the ancient context, the myth also explains the cycle of seasons, the bond between mother and daughter, and the sacred importance of Demeter's cult. The focus of the hymn is not simply Hades as a villain. It is Demeter's loss, Persephone's transition, Zeus's authority, and the cosmic compromise that follows. This matters because later, retellings often simplify the myth into a single emotional frame. Hades steals Persephone, therefore Hades is evil. But the ancient story is structurally more layered. Zeus is deeply involved. Demeter's grief reshapes the world. Persephone becomes queen of the underworld. The seasons become part of the myth's meaning. And Hades himself remains difficult to reduce. He's not innocent in the emotional conflict of the story, but he is also not the only force behind it. That complexity is exactly what modern retellings often flatten. Over time, Hades becomes easier to cast as the dark god because he already rules the dark place. The symbolism does the work before the source is even examined. But when we look at the source difference, we find something more interesting than a simple villain. We find a myth about authority, separation, return, grief, and cosmic balance. And Hades stands at the center of it, not as a monster, but as the figure who makes the boundary visible. Here is the turning point. Hades is feared because he rules the dead. But in many myths, he behaves with more consistency than the gods who live in the light. That does not make him gentle in a modern sense. It does not erase the seriousness of the Persephone myth, and it does not turn him into a purely kind figure. But it does challenge the common image of Hades as uniquely cruel. The contradiction is that the gods above often create the disorder, while the god below maintains the boundary after disorder has already happened. Hades does not need to be loved. He does not need temples on every hill. He does not compete constantly for attention in the myths. His power is not persuasive. It is structural. He keeps the dead where they belong. He guards the order of the underworld. He presides over a realm that mortals fear but cannot remove from existence. And that may be why ancient people avoided speaking his name directly. Not necessarily because he was evil, but because naming him brought the mind too close to what he represented. This is where the story changes direction. Maybe Hades became a villain not because the oldest myths demanded it, but because later imagination struggled to separate three ideas: death, the underworld, and evil. Once those three ideas collapse into one another, Hades becomes easy to misunderstand. But ancient Greek mythology kept them more distinct than many modern audiences realize. Thanatos could personify death. The underworld could be a realm of many destinations. And Hades could be its ruler without being the source of all harm. That does not make him soft, but it makes him far more complex. The emotional conflict of Hades is not that he is secretly cheerful or harmless. It is that his role makes him impossible to love in an ordinary way. Zeus can be worshipped as the sky that gives order. Poseidon can be honored as the sea that carries ships. Apollo can represent music, healing, and light. Athena can represent wisdom and strategy. But Hades? Hades represents the door no one wants to approach. Even if he is fair, he is still final. Even if he is lawful, his law is still frightening. Even if he is necessary, necessity can feel cold. That is the emotional cost of his myth. A god can be just and still be feared. A god can be needed and still be avoided. A god can preserve balance and still become the face of everything mortals dread. This may be why Hades feels lonely in the imagination. Not because every ancient story paints him as abandoned, but because his function separates him from celebration. He does not belong to weddings, harvest festivals, victories, or bright processions in the same way other gods might. He belongs to silence, to burial, to hidden wealth, to the names people hesitate to say. And yet that does not make him cruel. It makes him burdened with a role no other Olympian wanted. This is where the question of kindest Greek god becomes interesting. Was Hades kind? The answer depends on what we mean by kindness. If kindness means warmth, comfort, or emotional openness, Hades may not fit. But if kindness means restraint, consistency, and a refusal to create needless chaos, then Hades becomes surprisingly different from his modern reputation. He is not the god who endlessly disrupts the world above. He is the god who receives what the world above cannot keep. That kind of role may never look gentle, but it may still be more honorable than the stories we inherited led us to believe. The bigger meaning of Hades is not simply that he was actually good. That would be too easy. The deeper point is that Hades shows how cultures attach moral meaning to uncomfortable places. The sky feels open, so Zeus feels majestic. The sea feels powerful, so Poseidon feels grand. The underworld feels hidden, so Hades feels suspicious. But mythology often teaches through symbols, not simple labels. Hades is a symbol of the unseen, and the unseen is always vulnerable to misunderstanding. What is underground becomes associated with secrecy. What is silent becomes associated with threat. What is final becomes associated with cruelty. But beneath the earth are also roots, seeds, minerals, memory, the buried past that gives shape to the present. In that sense, Hades is not just the ruler of the dead. He is the keeper of what culture tries not to look at. The Greeks may have feared him, but they also gave him a place in the cosmic order. They did not erase him. They did not make him a meaningless demon. They made him a king. That is important. A king below is still a king. And perhaps this is what modern retellings often miss. Hades is not frightening because he is irrational. He is frightening because he is inevitable. He does not need to deceive anyone. He does not need to conquer the world. His kingdom grows without ambition because mortality itself brings every generation to his door. That is why making him a simple villain weakens the myth. A villain can be defeated. But Hades cannot be defeated in that way, because he represents a truth, not merely an enemy. The truth that every life has limits. The truth that every glory fades. The truth that every civilization, no matter how powerful, leaves something behind beneath the earth. Ruins, names, bones, coins, stories. And maybe that is why Hades remains so powerful. He does not ask us to fear evil. He asks us to face reality. So what have we misunderstood about Hades? Perhaps not everything. The ancient Greeks did fear him. His realm was not comforting. His myths could be severe, complicated, and emotionally difficult. But fear alone does not make a villain, and darkness alone does not mean evil. Hades may have become one of mythology's most misunderstood gods because he stood too close to the boundary every human being would rather ignore. He was not the bright hero, not the storm-bringing king, not the beautiful musician, not the clever strategist. He was the quiet ruler beneath all stories, the one who waited after the battle, after the voyage, after the harvest, after the empire, after the song. And maybe that is why his legacy changed, because it is easier to turn Hades into a villain than to admit that his realm was part of the natural order. It is easier to fear the god below than to ask why every culture buries its deepest truths underground. So perhaps the question is not whether Hades was the kindest Greek god. Perhaps the deeper question is this: if Hades was feared for ruling what every mortal must face, then was he truly the Dark One, or simply the most honest god in the Greek imagination?